Hey guys, welcome back to J&J Acres. I just wanted to post this video kind of like a postpartum update. I did one previously about my experience with postpartum depression, anxiety, and OCD. Those are three sort of separate conditions. However, they are linked, they can be linked, and one I have not experienced, postpartum psychosis, is also part of that. What's viewed now as kind of a spectrum because there are overlaps and there are differences. But over the last few months, I've done a lot of investigating with my medical team and just on my own about the differences in causes and triggers of postpartum anxiety and postpartum OCD specifically. And I wanted to share that in the context of kind of an organized view of the resources that I have made for myself in my journey postpartum. Hopefully it helps someone else that is maybe looking for resources or is starting their family or continuing their family and would like to strengthen their resources or add to them in any way, because I know that a lot of the times it isn't discussed or the resources aren't necessarily thrown at you or given to you. You have to know about them ahead of time and know where to search, and it gets really frustrating. So this is what I've done for myself, and I've had this little chart here to help myself. I had to make a graphic so that I could remember all of the pieces and kind of how they interconnect. So leave your questions down below. I'm sure this is gonna be a little bit disjointed. I could talk for days about postpartum resources and my experience with them, but I'm trying to sum it up in at least a smallish chunk of time. So what I usually start with when I'm talking about the journey of postpartum, however that looks for anybody, the top of the chart for me is community. And that could be your friends, your family, your neighbors, the human beings in your life one way or another. They don't necessarily even have to be close. They're just the people that you're around or that you frequently see, the people that you interact with. All of those people I just lump into the word community. And for me, the community that I am in or that I'm a part of helped me with food, money, and making time in my schedule. So they donated their time, or they donated their money, or they donated with their food and supplemented the supplies of those things that I had, or just acted like another body so that they could do the things. They could take up the time that needed to be taken up, and I could spend that same chunk of time doing whatever I needed to do. And it let me prioritize myself that way. And that's pregnancy leading into birth and postpartum for me. The next item, or the next, what do we even call these, bubbles? The next aspect, I guess, would be the hospital that I chose. And a lot of times we can't choose our community or choose the area in which we live. It's rare and very privileged to be able to do that. I specifically went outside of my city to go to a hospital that I specifically wanted to attend. And this was in 2019 that I chose this hospital because I had just found out that I was pregnant. And during that pregnancy, the early scans were done by just an ER medical tech. I had gone in because I thought I was feeling really off and really sick. That pregnancy turned out to be a molar pregnancy, but we didn't know until I had already told all my friends and family. We had already had that scan that showed a heartbeat. It was pretty traumatizing to discover once because I discovered this right before Thanksgiving, told friends and family, then came back and discovered that not only was I not pregnant, I was developing the molar pregnancy inside my body. My body thought I was still pregnant. And more so, that molar pregnancy, it's a partial molar, that's why we were able to find something growing in there and a heartbeat early on. That partial molar pregnancy would keep growing and spread throughout my body if it were not removed. And the removal is a surgery that is pretty commonly done. However, it's really comforting for me to have had a specialist on my team. I had specifically gone from the ER experience, finding out that I was pregnant, to then going to this other hospital in order to continue my pregnancy monitoring at that other hospital. I had heard from nurses in the ER that was a really positive experience for a lot of their nurse friends and a lot of their doctor friends going through that particular hospital. So I said, I want to get on that train, I want to get on that boat, I love that. So I went there, and that's the place that I discovered that I had a partial molar pregnancy. So right off the bat, it was an introduction to my medical team in pretty down circumstances, pretty emotionally turbulent circumstances, and in a time and place where I was totally new to it. I really had to be led by my team. So I have just written in my notes here that for me, hospital choice, or picking the right hospital for you, is good for if you need surgeries, if your baby needs treatment in the NICU, or if you need consistent medical testing. Like from my experience, after I got my first surgery, my first DNC to remove the molar pregnancy, I went back on feeling like I wasn't quite right, like I was feeling pregnant again. Found out that the molar pregnancy had started to regrow, so had a second DNC for that. And in order to get the second DNC, my team took scans and did tests, but nothing conclusive was showing up, so they went off of my gut instinct. We went in for that second surgery, and they did find growing tissue that was molar. So I'm really glad that they trusted my gut, and that team specifically said, you know what, we're going off of what you can feel, because what you can feel is probably accurate, and we're going to do this based on your experience. And of course, the team that did the surgeries was just amazing. Like the doctor that I had filling in for my OB during the second DNC, she was on vacation or traveling, or she couldn't get back in time or something, but that second doctor had been doing the DNC procedure since I was born. So I felt and it's not like it was a situation where her skills would have been antiquated by now, or that she was frail in any way. She was just a really, really capable surgeon. So I felt really grateful for that experience. And then I had weekly blood tests after that for 6 months, just to make sure that there was no pregnancy chemical in my body, because a rise in that could indicate that tissue was regrowing. That's one of the dangers of partial molar pregnancies, and more so in complete molar pregnancies, that the tissue is in the lining of your uterus, or it gets into the lining of your uterus and then beyond that into different areas of your body. I did not have that happen. Luckily, I did not have a need for any further treatment. I just needed to go back and get these medical tests for the next 6 months after that. And that had been my first experience with pregnancy. So being in a place, in an environment where it was mentally healthy for me to go in there week to week to week, to be completely reminded of this trauma over and over and over again, it was a small grace in that time of just extreme turbulence in my body, because I was going through extreme chemical withdrawals, going from overly pregnant chemically to having no chemicals being released into my bloodstream. It sent me into an absolute depth of depression that I had never experienced before. I felt like I lost a good 2 months of my life, and I don't really remember a lot of it. It was a lot of inability to communicate, a massive breakdown of the higher functions of my brain. The OBGYN role in a birthing process or a pregnancy process, overlapping with your midwife, those roles are, for me, they were integral to my hospital experience because my hospital had a birth center attached, so everyone was in the know. There was a lot of communication. The surgery team and my OB team and everyone knew who each other were, could share documents. I was known and recognized within the clinic. That was really important to me. So a reproductive and birthing specialist is just someone that I would recommend having, whether that's yourself or whether that's a dedicated partner or a doula or a midwife or an OBGYN, or even staff that you trust, that you hadn't worked with before, but you go into a situation, maybe an emergency situation, and you have to work with what you have. Connecting with them, connecting with that person was really essential for me to have a good experience. And that OB or the OBGYN who found my molar pregnancy on our first appointment was the one that delivered my baby a full year and a half, I believe, later, which was really, really special to me. I found my family care practitioner before I gave birth, while I was still pregnant, and my whole family, meaning myself, my husband, and our future child, were all in a state of transition between primary care doctors, because we had moved 5 years ago to a new area, and we just hadn't gone through the process of finding our primary care people, our like family dentist or family doctor or anything like that. So we did some research, looked around, and found a clinic that we really liked and a doctor within the clinic that we really liked. And this clinic that I really liked also has a birth center attached to it and is like 1 mile away from the regional hospital there, which I also got to tour later on, ironically, because my baby was so jaundiced that when we visited the family health care practitioner, they said, this is a situation we need to address really soon, presently, so I'm sending you to this special team that's open right now. You're going to go see them. You're going to do all these tests based on the appointment that we just had today. So I felt really accommodated, I guess, but I felt like I was taken care of, even though my really emotionally close OB and hospital team that I delivered with were closed at that time, or closed to me anyway, because I wasn't actively delivering. Either that, or it now would be a separate area of the hospital because I had already given birth, something along those lines. But we were sent to a team that was like equally great. We were cared for equally well, equally comfortable there, and the health of our baby was addressed at the primary health clinic that we chose, I think 4 days after his birth, which was essential for his recovery from my milk not coming in for 5 days and from him being extremely jaundiced. So your primary care physician or your primary care practitioner, I suggest to try and find one that you like and that your family likes, that all of you can go see, husband, wife, partner, spouse, child, children, any of you can go see on a regular basis, because it consolidates how many people are talking about your health, and who is recommending what, and it almost makes that information go from your brain for like a master storage device into the brain of the doctor for them keeping track of all of your things. They're the ones that keeps track of all your medical history, your immunizations. They recognize you and your family, and they're able to kind of guide you in a way that's a lot more consolidated than just doing piecemeal. One doctor for you, one doctor for spouse, and one doctor or for partner, and one doctor for children or family members that aren't yourself. It makes it a lot easier. So, birth centers. We visited a birth center after my baby was born because of the jaundice, but previously we had the pleasure of actually delivering in the birth center that was attached to this hospital that I really, really liked. So that experience for me was phenomenal. It had the safety that I felt like I needed, and there were a few complications during the birth that were managed very, very well. And I feel like I was well supported by a variety of staff members. We had at our disposal, my partner was allowed to be with me at the time of the birth and throughout labor and delivery and recovery, which was phenomenal. We were provided with, I want to say, but on staff was a nurse, and then she had other nurses that were supporting her so that she could dedicate time to myself and our experience. But there were also midwife nurses who had experience in alternative medicine and alternative birthing practices. So I felt like I had a bigger variety of care at my fingertips and helping me out and wanting me to succeed. And that was really, really important for me. I wanted to feel like I had options during a time when I generally had to just roll with the punches, because that's what oftentimes pregnancy and birth dictates. You're not in control a lot of the time. You're sometimes not connected with your whole body and the beautiful machine that is actually doing the mechanics of everything, and it can seem like a complete disconnect. And I felt like the medical team in the birth center attached to the hospital, who was in constant communication with my OB, was really attuned to that possible disconnect and was helping me connect with my process, which was absolutely precious to me. As far as breastfeeding goes, fed is best. Across the board, fed is best. I wanted to try to do breastfeeding as much as I could, and my journey with breastfeeding has been long and scary. I had a lot of mental obstacles feeding my baby anything but breast milk. I also had a huge blank in how long a baby should go without breast milk, and all of the new experiences of someone who has not necessarily been around a lot of very, very young babies in their life. This was the first very, very young baby I had managed or I had experience with. It was my own. I'm one of the oldest in like a wave of cousins, so there really hasn't been too much of a precedent, and I haven't necessarily delved into the personal, detailed postpartum stories, after birth stories, because I've read a lot of birth stories, but the next 2 weeks is a whole story again, and I think I totally missed the ball on reading those, because what was more important in the end was me figuring out how to nourish my baby. My body and the doctors took care of getting the baby out. And there were so many points where I was supposed to be using my best judgment, and my judgment was based on my own experience. And being inexperienced, I had a lot of blind spots. So that took Lactation Consultants from the birthing center where that was attached to the hospital that I gave birth in. It started with the nurses and lactation consultants on staff teaching my baby how to latch very slowly and very carefully over the course of the 24 hours or so I was there in recovery. And then after that, I saw the lactation specialist at my primary care office, the primary care doctor's office, which has a birth center attached that I hadn't been a participant in at that point, but they said, oh, this is a feeding problem, or this is a supply problem, this is something that can be resolved, it has to do with breast milk. I can teach you how to use your pump, I can teach you how to help get your milk flowing and whatnot. There was just a heavy emphasis at my primary care office on maternal health, which I have not found so far in other primary care offices, which I really appreciate, being a first-time mother. And then at that day 4 or 5 mark, when my baby was basically just evaluated as dangerously underweight for his progression in days after birth and being very, very jaundiced, I was sent to that regional birth center. The birth center attached to that clinic was only open for those current birthing mothers. So I went to that regional hospital's birthing clinic. I know that's been 3 total birth centers that I've talked about, but bear with me. And that regional birthing center had their own team of lactation consultants. So that's round 3 of lactation consultants, plural, that also came and asked how I was holding the baby, how I was nursing, how I was holding my breast, how I was doing every facet of the actions behind that, and just saying such supportive things. I mean, if you're going on round 3 of something this important and you still haven't figured it out, it can be really, 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 really defeating and scary. And somehow all of these women, they were all women, communicated to me that I was doing a good job and that I should keep going and that I had it in me to do this, and that one way or another I would be feeding my baby. And that was a totally unprecedented experience, not just from like one team, but from every single team, and not just from one individual on each team. It was from every individual on every team. So that was basically the 3rd set of lactation consultants. And from there, I realized that I needed more help. I needed help addressing my own mental obstacles so that I could provide the best I could and be the best mother I could be. So I invested in finding, I think first yes. Recommended her. Okay. So once I realized that I wanted to find myself more resources than I had accumulated at that point, I reached out to one of my friends who, or actually I might have put something on Facebook, but I reached out and I looked for someone who would specifically be a medical care provider for post-birth. So any perinatal specialist who only focused on that. And I got one recommendation that I'm so glad that I got. She is now what I call my medical coordinator, but really she's a perinatal physician. So she recommended to me specific people that could then unlock different portions of my perinatal experience. So the first person that was recommended to me was a lactation consultant that made house calls. So after 3 rounds of lactation consultants and me getting maybe halfway to where I wanted to be, I called this lactation specialist, essentially, and she came out and spent an entire afternoon assessing things that were opportunities for positive change. So there weren't necessarily problems, but there were a lot of opportunities for an improved experience, whether that be different sleep patterns, different feeding patterns, me having a different experience feeding my baby, or my baby having a different experience being fed or communicating needs, because it's so automatic when they're really, really young that it can seem like you're either like feeding an ever hungry machine, or it can feel like there's some kind of disconnect between mother and child. There can be a lot of different experiences than we're told are to be expected, and I definitely had unexpected feelings and unexpected experiences around feeding in general. So that was a specialist who helped me address and manage the needs of the baby and voice some of my needs as a feeder of this baby, whether it be through formula or breast milk. And that specific lactation consultant wanted to give me a resource to further my baby's development in his nursing journey, because there's a lot of muscle development that happens in babies depending on what their feeding situation is. And for each route that you can choose to feed your baby, there's going to be slightly different muscle development. So to align my baby with his own muscle development and maximize what he's already got developing and going on and growing and giving me tools to build on that, I got recommended to a speech language pathologist. So this speech language pathologist specifically addressed infants, and from like newborn up through children, all of the mechanics that are involved with nursing efficiency or feeding efficiency or mouth positioning. Very, very in-depth, very, very specialized, very, very mechanically and physical therapy oriented. That's what this specific speech language pathologist provided for me. I took my baby in to the speech language pathologist, I think maybe 3 times, and we did 1 or 2 sessions over Zoom to touch base as well. And her office was like very, very accommodating to me as a newly postpartum mom. I got a nice comfy couch to sit on. There was a lot of hands-on positioning and teaching and assessing, and the exercises that I got to boost the correct muscles and to step away from some muscular habits that were forming in my baby were extraordinarily helpful. And from there, I got another recommendation for a further step if it needed to be done, and it did wind up being the option that I chose. So at this point, my resources were gathering more resources for me. I had done the legwork to find the people that could then unlock the resources as I needed. I no longer had to do the research and look at reviews and all of that. They knew the people who were good at their job, and they knew the people who were experienced and professional and could provide for the needs that I voiced as I worked to find those needs with that, I call her my medical coordinator or that perinatal physician. So now we're going from the speech language pathologist to a pediatric dentist. Okay, so the pediatric dentist that I went and saw was highly recommended to me, one, because of the way that he interacts with his patients and their families. I really appreciate that. And two, working in a field that was very, very, very niche. What he was able to do at his clinic was not just cut tongue ties, and lip ties, but actually remove them with a laser. So getting the whole area cauterized with the laser, and the tissue that was able to be removed very quickly and without putting too much stress on the parents, which was an unexpected benefit. I was expecting to be there for the whole thing, just like I was for the initial tongue clipping I did at my primary care doctor's office when I was assessing what was needed to improve the latch of my baby and improve the breastfeeding from my end as well. A couple weeks prior, we had gotten that tongue clip. It still didn't do the job, so working with the speech language pathologist got his musculature up to a point where I felt confident that we had gone as far as we could, and I was still seeing those habits. And for me, those habits were eating for long periods of time and eating more frequently than was maybe possible for my baby. So I worked with medical professionals and lactation consultants and had them assess whether it was possible, given the weight and health of my baby and all the other factors involved, for me to feed him less frequently than I was. I was feeding every hour and a half to 2 hours around the clock, and around the first 1 month mark, I felt like I was absolutely losing my mind, and I basically was. It fed into my postpartum anxiety and OCD, and just the whole experience that I was having. It was going downhill so fast, and I wanted to try to get feeding to be an element that was helping instead of hindering my recovery. So after assessing what was appropriate for my baby, and after getting the physical analysis, the tongue clip, the mouth therapy to get his mouth in a really good place and all those face muscles in a really good place, we proceeded with that recommendation that I got from the speech language pathologist of the pediatric dentist, and we got the tongue and lip tie removal. And the recovery for that, it was intense. We had 1 full week of a really, really fussy baby after the whole month of sleep deprivation, or I think at that point it was 2 full months of sleep deprivation. It was a lot, but I can tell you that after the first couple days, his latch was completely different. Even right off the bat, like later on that day, I could notice that his latch was very, very different. And the time that he took to eat went from when he was really, really young, like maybe a half an hour to an hour, went down as we got to the lactation consultants to maybe a half hour, and then the speech language pathologist and the tongue clipping kind of reduced that to maybe 25 minutes, 20 minutes, and then the tongue and lip tie removal cut that time down to about 5 minutes, where he would eat 5 to 10 minutes, I should say. He would eat anywhere between 2 and 6 ounces in that time. And it was just mind-blowing how different his behavior turned out to be after that. I think at that point, we realized that our baby had the capability and had the rhythms, was displaying the rhythms of wanting to sleep for longer stretches of time. And that's when we identified me as the inhibitor of that. My postpartum anxiety did not allow me rest, and it did not allow me to process my postpartum OCD in a healthy way and find the resources to help myself with that. We identified that if the baby was sleeping with me, then I could get enough rest to not have a mental breakdown, but it was like a slow plane crash instead of a fast plane crash. And we found out eventually through a lot of experimentation that my baby wound up doing better without co-sleeping with me after I got the postpartum OCD and anxiety under control, because I didn't do better with separation before that. So not to get too ahead of myself, but after we got his tongue and lip ties removed, he started eating much faster and much more than he was before. Things were looking good there. I was still in a lot of pain and discomfort from birthing, and I got recommended to two people from my perinatal physician, my medical coordinator. I got referred back to my surgeon at the hospital that I'd given birth at, and I got referred to, pardon me, I think I swallowed a bug. And I got referred to a pelvic floor therapist. So the pelvic floor therapist and the surgeon were both positioned to address the same issue. And the issue I was having primarily was extreme pain while passing any kind of bowel movement at all. And then just feeling a lot of pressure and discomfort in my whole vaginal area, which I knew was possibly a symptom of prolapse. So I went to the surgeon and got my booty hole checked out, and that surgeon, this wasn't the same one that did my DNCs. This was one that specialized in rectal health, which was fantastic. That surgeon said, okay, you can go with your pelvic floor specialist that you're about to go see, and you can do physical therapy through her and do these creams and do this medication and see if that helps after 8 weeks. And if it doesn't solve your problem in 8 weeks, come back and we can do what is it called? Laparoscopic. Let me look it up. Okay, not laparoscopic. I got okay. So the rectal surgeon that I consulted said that at the time stamp that I was in, basically being 8 or 9 weeks after giving birth, having had this condition for that period of time, I technically just qualified as having a chronic anal fissure as opposed to an acute one, I believe. Do I need to Google that? But anyway, so my condition was borderline between chronic and something that could heal on its own, but I was told that I would likely need the surgery, or it didn't always play out that the treatments that she offered that were non-surgical would actually work, and it would take months for me to know, and I'd be in pain the whole time anyway, and I was in the middle of breastfeeding, so figuring out if all those things were safe for breastfeeding was a whole other conundrum. But I did know that the surgery that she offered was not foolproof, but very close to. I think it was considered the gold standard in procedures. And I did decide to go the surgical route and then do preventative measures for any future tearing or any future fissures through my pelvic floor specialist. So I saw my pelvic floor specialist, informed her that I was about to undergo surgery to correct the anal fissure, and we made a plan for how we were going to do my treatment and recovery and all of that. I went and did the surgery and then spent about a week in the worst recovery period I had ever gone through for anything. and I went through 2 DNCs and a vaginal birth, although I did have an epidural. It was absolutely terrifying, the amount of pain and discomfort I was in. But after those few days, and after I adjusted my stool softening techniques, I guess you could call them, I switched from stool softeners to magnesium, which really did the trick. I have not been in pain since. I feel like I've learned a lot about just sensations in that entire area and if they're good or bad, and I've been developing a much more positive connection just with all of that anatomy through my pelvic floor specialist. And my pelvic floor specialist could confirm that the pressure that I was feeling was largely anxiety related and just everything moving back to where it's supposed to be, rather than prolapse. So that was really, really good to hear. That was really needed positive news after going through 2 months of 1.5 to 2 hours of sleep at a time, if that, and then getting the tongue and lip tie laser surgery for my baby, and then a week after that, me having surgery to correct anal fissures, which turned out to be so deep they had to actually stitch things together because the muscle was exposed. It would not have rectified. It would not have healed on its own without an actual manual closing of the fissure, which was in a way of indication, but a very painful one. So after that 2-month mark and all of those improvements happened at once, I was still in the place where my baby had just recovered, I had barely just recovered just from the surgery, and I was at the point where everyone's physical needs were, the emergent ones anyway, had been addressed, but I was still doing the slow tanking and the slow decline with a lot of mental breakdowns in the middle, in between all of those. So the final person I added to my crew, or added to my team, through my perinatal physician, my medical coordinator, which is so nice that I call her my medical coordinator because she was the one who recommended most of these other people and had the most communication between all of them. I was suggested to try meeting with a specifically dedicated perinatal counselor or therapist, psychologist. And that took me from just surviving and just getting through to actually opening doors for thriving. And that last edition really felt like it completed my circle of resources. And I tried to progress through my circle of resources in a somewhat chromatic way or a somewhat logical way. If you wanted to look at them like, who should I add to my team first? Who should I add to my team last? That's kind of how I organized my chart. But having a perinatal psychologist as you're going through pregnancy and then delivery and then birth is not a bad idea at all. I think it would have been extraordinarily helpful if I had found my perinatal psychologist first, and if I had found my community of supportive nurturers. They're all mothers in this particular group. If I had found that while I was pregnant, it would have made my postpartum journey very different. However, I'm still very, very pleased with the postpartum journey that I have been experiencing. It's one of those shoulda, woulda, couldas, but I would have no way of having known about certain resources that I would need prior. I just gathered the resources I thought that I would need, and the people that would find me the rest of them. So the rest of them turned out to be this perinatal psychologist who was trauma informed and has been working with me ever since. And I call it the moms group, but it is a, right now, virtual group of mothers in all stages of motherhood, with some supportive leaders to the group that made a space to hold any experience that motherhood brought. The good, the bad, the ugly, loss, grief, joy, that space. It came all the way around from the community that I started with through all these resources to a new community that I hadn't discovered yet and that I was welcomed into after working my way through that circle and getting in touch with all of those needs. And I stepped into that holding space of mothers, and that community has it's made me feel like all of the hard parts of motherhood could have offsets in the joy department, could actually produce a joyful, satisfying, very dynamic and vibrant experience, even though there is the pain. So that was helpful. And then the perinatal psychologist has been working with me on taking my internal landscape to the next level health-wise, which was and has been very, very vital. I found that, or rather, I think my husband found out that I was getting to a point where my postpartum anxiety and OCD was triggering so many negative thoughts internally that I was starting to view my baby differently than I did right after his birth. I was starting to have intrusive thoughts of harming my baby, which is very common if you get to the point of this level of sleep deprivation and malnourishment and trauma recovery. It's an element that isn't commonly talked about, but is commonly experienced. And there are resolutions to it, which is, it didn't seem like there was at the time. And this is about 4 months in at this point, where my intrusive thoughts and my lack of sleep, it demanded a change. And my husband was the one who asked me to step away from being a mother for 3 days. And it was extremely hard to hear. And it's not like he was telling me on his own. He was working with my medical team. We were all on a phone call together with my medical coordinator, and I was in text communication with my perinatal psychologist, and they were talking together. Luckily, they're very dialed in. They were all speaking with the two of us saying, okay, Jessica, you need to step away in order to try to give yourself a reset. And that was just the appropriate plan for me, given my history and given my mental landscape at that time. And it was so the right thing for me to have done that I can't even communicate it. Right at the 4-month mark or so, I spent 3 days outside the house, and I did come back during the day to just observe the difference in parenting that between myself and my spouse, and try to learn new and better ways to achieve my motherhood goals and and to cultivate that type of connection that I really wanted to have with my son. And during that step away, I got uninterrupted sleep for the first time in 4 months. Up until then, I had slept in 2-hour increments for that straight 4 months. And I was not capable of a lot of mental thought. I couldn't really complete any sentences. I was starting to go into emergency or panic mode, where you start making decisions that are not rational at all, and it just feels like you're trying not to die 24/7. Or at least that was my experience in that particular climate. Just to sum it up very quickly, it felt like I was going to die all the time. So that lifted somewhat. And then once I came back, once I started sleeping in the home, we continued with my husband being the nighttime caretaker. And what was so interesting was that the 3 days that I was away, my husband had really gotten a connection time with our son that he didn't have previously, because I was very, very attached and very protective and very like, no, I'll do it, for every perceived need that our child had. But he figured out that that was a lot of feeding back and forth of anxiety and amplification. So once I was out of the picture for a good 24 hours, our baby was sleeping just about through the night, and he was eating at a far different schedule, maybe once every 4 hours or more, instead of every 1.5 to 2 hours, which was huge. He was able to sleep in his crib basically on his own. He was able to be put down for naps, and he would fall asleep on his own, or at least fall asleep in your arms, and you could set him down and he would continue to sleep. And I will say, disclaimer, our child is one of the best sleepers, and was straight out of the womb, that I had ever even heard about. So keep in mind, this is my experience with a perfect child. So that's how much I felt like the problem at this point. I knew that our son was the opposite of a fussy baby, and I still couldn't do it right. I couldn't mother right. So at that point, I had come home, I had reintegrated during the daytime, and I had handed over the nighttime duties. So I was still in the house. I could still hear if he was crying, if our baby was crying, but I wasn't the one who was addressing that need. So after about 2 weeks of kind of that slow reintroduction into being a caretaker, I started taking over every other feeding time during the night. So if he only woke up once, that would be either myself or my husband that fed him and put him back to bed. And we have since learned, just the other night actually, that if I fall asleep breastfeeding him in bed and leave him in bed with us, like co-sleep with him, that he will wake me up every 2 hours, or I will respond to him every 2 hours. We slip back into that pattern. So we have to rely on the system that my husband found that really worked, which was napping him throughout the day as he showed signs of being sleepy, and then feeding as much as we could right before bed, and then feeding once or twice in the middle of the night, and that's it. And actually putting him back in the crib to finish the night in the crib. That seems to be what works best for the three of us, because it is really a connection in my circumstance between the three of us. It is not necessarily what is right for anyone else, or anyone else's child, or anyone else as a parent. All of that sleeping situation and sleep training and all that, that's up to each individual family and each individual parent. But trying to connect me with my experience of being a mother, I had to make some huge changes to how I thought I would nurture my baby, which included feeding, like changing everything, like diaper changing and everything else. So at this point, our baby is about 5.5 months old, and I am now feeling like I'm picking up an equal share of the parenting duties or actions. I'm still very much in recovery from postpartum, physically and mentally and emotionally. And I am on the path with primarily my perinatal psychologist and my medical coordinator to finish in this chapter of my postpartum recovery and enter into the next chapter of parenthood, like as the future dictates, because I never count my chickens before they hatch. We do have plans to continue growing our family, but we don't know when, and we don't necessarily have any expectations revolving around that, because I know how that can go or not go, especially after dealing with a miscarriage in my past. So at this point, those were the resources that I found most helpful. I'll give a recap of that, and I'll throw the chart up here just because I really want to pass on as clear language as I can the resources that I used and the order that they kind of cropped up in my experience, but more so the fact that I'll probably touch through each one of those things again as I reach the next chapter, being a mother and with my son growing into his next chapter of life. So the first and foremost, and the last, I guess you could say, community that helped me with food, money, and time. Hospitals, primarily the two that I attended, one for my birth and surgeries, and the other one that had a birthing center in the hospital that addressed my baby's jaundice. My OBGYN for reproductive and birthing oriented things. That included for us family planning after my molar pregnancy. Family primary care physician that we found specifically to have one person that would be a health check-in person for myself, my husband, and our baby. The birth center that was attached to the hospital that I did give birth at, I was really well monitored there, and baby was well taken care of. The lactation specialists and consultants, all of them, I'm sure I spoke to dozens, that just addressed every question that I didn't even know that I had yet about lactation, and more so about actually feeding my baby, because that was really what it was at the end of the day. It wasn't about breast milk, it was about tummies being full. The speech language pathologist that I worked with, who just took so much care and so much thought into everything she recommended, and all of the things that she foresaw as being something that I would want to address and something that I could decide to do or not do, to further improve or further take steps to make my baby's life and my life easier. My perinatal physician, which turned into my medical coordinator, she linked all of my resources together, and she acted as my brain when my brain was absent, and I could not be more grateful. My perinatal psychologist, who works with me ongoing to understand my birth experience and my motherhood experience, as well as probably my whole life experience, but it all gets brought up when you have a baby, I swear. My pelvic floor therapist, which I am still seeing to address any pelvic floor and just torso-oriented discomfort, strengthening, pain, the whole gamut of the experience, and to make sure that things that are unseen are validated and understood, and to make a space of very positive inquiry about the areas that culturally we're just told to not think about or not pay attention to or are culturally areas of trauma. The pediatric dentist that I saw that removed my baby's tongue and lip ties, just top-notch, very niche specialist in what he does. We had a fantastic experience at that office, and then in recovery, and the follow-up was very thorough, which I really appreciate. And then again, the community that I found of women who are part of this specific group that are part of a holding space, or a space where it's roomy enough to fit the whole experience of motherhood, whatever that is, all the things that it turns out to be. In a place where you can share it, you can learn to share it, you can also learn other people's experiences, and there's no judgment. It's just a space where those experiences exist. And that was pretty radical for me. I think it's been something that I look forward to almost as much as my psychology Zoom meetings. And since it's virtual, I was able to do it without leaving my safe space of being at my house. And that, for a time, was very essential to me. Now, there are some opportunities to meet in person, but I think for the most part I'll be continuing virtually because I've been happy with that so far. So that's how it's worked for me, and that was kind of a disjointed half birth story, half postpartum story, half miscarriage story, just lots of halves of various separate stories that are very much all touching on the resources that I try to provide myself. And I didn't want to put this out until I felt like those resources were complete for this part of my journey. Going forward, 1 year and beyond, I'm sure that those resources are going to change and the balance are going to change. But for now, each of those specific elements were the elements that I feel like if I had all of those people on my list going into birthing my baby, I would have had a more positive journey than I've had thus far. But even then, I really, really do, as hard as it's been, I really do feel like I have been on the fast track to recovery, considering the time span that many, many, many parents deal with, of many, many years of postpartum grief and trauma processing, and oftentimes birthing PTSD, so many things that just feed into years and years of struggle. And I feel like I came to a point where my struggle is held safely and my struggle is cared for. That's the best way I can describe it at this point. And the struggle itself is losing power over the elements of my life that I want to cultivate, over my experience, over my relationships. I really do feel like that process has been fast, very, very accelerated compared to other experiences, even though comparison is a terrible thing to do and every single experience is different. But it's just something that I wanted to voice, that I don't feel like I have regrets. I feel like I would love if everyone was able to obtain these resources, or just have these phone numbers stored away, or have these practitioners just printed out and put in a binder or something. I would feel so great knowing that people knew that these systems and these resources existed. And of course, the next step is reaching out and starting to break those taboos and continuing shining light on some of those darker areas that we have in America of like the bootstrap mentality doesn't help you through postpartum a lot of the time, I will say. So although the bootstrapping mentality has its perks, I feel like American values sometimes make postpartum journeys so much more painful than they need to be. And my contribution is sharing the resources that I found that I really liked and sharing parts of my story. So I've started putting parts of my story up on my blog at jessicacartwright.org. I've also started putting out postpartum oriented videos. I have a previous one on this channel where I talked about my postpartum routine, and that was around the 3-month mark, I think, that I put it out. I honestly cannot remember. Time has been weird. I have blanks in my memory, and I can't remember at which times I did what. So you'll have to check back. But my son was born March 2nd. So just figure out from there how long it took me to make that video, and that's how far along I was. But if you have any questions, or if you want to hear more about specific aspects of my story, definitely reach out, definitely comment below. I love to share, and I love to talk back and forth and just figure out a better way for not just myself to move forward, but for other people who come to my channel to move forward with whatever their story is. And all stories are valid and accepted on my channel. So I hope to hear from you. Definitely click like and subscribe if you want to like and subscribe, but if not, that's cool too. This is not about subscribers. This one is just for me and just for you. So I will see you guys later. Again, this is Jessica from J&J Acres, and have a good day or night wherever you are.